Thank you. I'm Sharon Flynt from Scott County Cooperative Extension. I'm the horticulture agent there. And so we're just going to jump right in to our program. Asparagus, Latin name is Asparagus officinalis. Botanically, it's a member of the lily family, and it's closely related to onions and leeks. And that's important to remember later on when we talk about picking out a site for your asparagus bed. It's a hardy perennial vegetable. It's one of our earliest spring vegetables harvested. And because of that, if you were growing this commercially, say for a farmer's market or something, that makes it a premium vegetable because, well, for many reasons, but one, it's one of the earliest in the spring, and then also just because of the cultivation of it and that, you know, it's a bed, it's not easily just grown every year. You have to plan, and it takes several years to get it started. Okay, a little history. Asparagus has been cultivated for over 200 years, or 2,000 years, I'm sorry. It's native to the Asian and European coastal areas. Early European settlers brought it here to North America, and it's been grown in colonial gardens, you know, from then on. Commercially, production in the U.S. began in the mid-1800s. Now, asparagus is something that has a dormancy. We talked about it being a hardy perennial. And dormancy occurs when the soil temperature is below approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So in the spring, as the soil starts to warm up, then once it begins to warm up to over 50 degrees Fahrenheit, then your asparagus should start to sprout. So there's really not a certain time you can pinpoint, but you can always depend on that soil temperature. Once it goes over 50 degrees Fahrenheit, then you will start to see your asparagus sprout if everything else is okay with your asparagus bed. Also, water is a limiting supply. And in tropical regions where they do not have a cold dormancy period, if they grow asparagus there, that's how they put their asparagus beds to rest. They withdraw water from it. So that's also good to know here that, you know, if we go through a drought or something, sometimes that can cause your plants to go into a dormant period. And really the dormant period is where the plant is preserving the energy for spear production in the following season. Okay, the parts of asparagus, this is what it looks like. You have fleshy roots there. A good asparagus transplant will have thick, fleshy roots. They will be lighter in color. Also, you'll be able to see a little feathery type crown there. And that is where the vegetative budding comes from. And you should see little buds there if you look at it closely. And then the edible part of the plant is the shoot, or as spear, that emerges from the soil. And then left uncut, the spear will go on to develop that fern-like foliage you see there on the right. Okay, so what happens generally in the production of, or in the life cycle of an asparagus plant? If the spears are not harvested, then they develop into those tall asparagus ferns that you see there. They are at least 4 to 6 feet in height. This is where all the carbohydrates and other compounds necessary for the plant growth and development are produced. It's produced in those ferns throughout the growing season, and then that energy or that food is translocated to the fleshy roots where they are stored. And that energy is used to produce the spears the following spring. And then in the early spring, again, as I mentioned, once that soil temperature is right, you will start to see spears emerge from the soil. Now that leads us to site selection. So where is the best place for your asparagus bed? An asparagus bed is an investment. They can live from 15 to 25 years, maybe even a little longer. And if you interplant from time to time to keep your asparagus bed going, this could be a very long-term type gardening project. So you need a site that has at least 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. The soil needs to be well drained. It also needs to have good air drainage on the site. And that just simply means no low-lying areas. And because, as we know, heat rises to the top. So if you have your asparagus bed in a low-lying valley or hollow, something like that, then the cold air collects there and will, may cause some damage in the spring. Also, it can delay your sprouting just because the soil will be colder there as well. Also, you want to avoid areas where onions and leeks and other members of the lily family, remember we said that would be important later, have recently grown. Because they're all in the same family, they do share the same types of diseases and that sort of thing. So you want to give your asparagus the best chance it has, and you don't want to plant it back into somewhere where maybe there were some plants there in its family that had some disease problems and that sort of thing. Also, because asparagus, the ferns get so tall and you do allow it to grow all summer long because of the energy storage, you want to consider where the sun is and where the directions are in your garden. So if you planted it close to your regular garden, you would want to make sure that your asparagus plants are north of your regular garden, so that as the sun goes over it during the day, you see there that any shadows cast, it won't be cast upon your regular garden and shade out other vegetables that may need, and then probably need, the 6 to 8 plus hours of sunlight. Okay, we're starting a little backwards here, and I taught this class 2 years ago as well in the spring, and really we should offer this class in the fall because that is the best time for your bed preparation. You want to prepare that bed in the fall before spring planting, if possible. It's not always possible, so you can go ahead and plant a bed this spring and still be able to grow asparagus. But for the very best management practices, you might want to consider starting in the fall. And after you have chosen the best site for your asparagus bed, then in the fall, you can enrich that bed with dried manure, and that's only in the fall, and compost or leaf mold or a combination of all of those things. Also, you do not want to forget, collect and take a soil sample to your local cooperative extension office. If there is a cooperative extension office in every county in Kentucky, and they all have access to getting soil samples taken, and they can get that information back to you. Sometimes it just depends on the county. Sometimes it's free of charge, and sometimes they may charge you just a small fee, but generally it's very small if there is any fee involved. Very small when you think relative to the amount of fertilizer that you could save yourself, or additives that you could save yourself because you only added what was needed. And there again, only add fertilizer or any line recommendations or anything like that, only if it is recommended by a soil test. So, fertility. In the fall, prepare the bed as early as possible and enrich it with, we talked about that, the dried manure, the compost, leaf mold. In the spring, let's say this is next year or years afterwards, you want to have your soil test. We've talked about that. Apply the fertilizer according to soil test recommendations before planting, and this is in the spring. You may get your soil tested in the fall, but you want to apply your amendments, say you need fertilizer in the spring. However, if you do need to apply lime or any additives like that, you would want to apply that in the fall because lime does take time over months to actually do the best job in your soil and react with everything in your soil to help bring, and usually that is to help bring your pH up if you're adding lime. Asparagus is not a heavy nitrogen feeder, so your fertility really needs to be brought up to the medium-high levels of the required amounts of potassium and phosphorus. And both of those are responsible for root production and fern production and that sort of thing. And we've talked about how that's very important to an asparagus, because everything that goes on in the fern production and your root production affects your spear output for the next spring. Okay, pH is very important with asparagus. Asparagus grows best in a pH of, let's say, around 6.5 to maybe 7. That's very close, just a little bit below the neutral point. It does not tolerate extremely acidic soils. However, to a certain point, asparagus will grow at lower pHs, and that's, below that 6.5. However, it does not grow well, and it seems to struggle, and research has shown that the lower pHs are more conducive to the growth of the fungal pathogen Fusarium and other types of fungal diseases. And Fusarium crown and root rot survives better in lower pH soils. Now in the spring, when you're getting ready for your bed, again, you can add compost. And compost is not soil. That's not a soil you're adding to it. It consists of primarily decomposed or partially decomposed plant and animal residue. It can contain a small amount of soil, but compost really is there to help improve the physical condition of your soil and soil. It does also help, a roundabout way, your soil fertility. So that's why compost is important. The organic matter will improve heavy clay soils. It helps bind to soil particles, so it makes it sort of crumbly and crummy. It's easier to work. It helps improve the aeration, root penetration, water infiltration, and it'll help to reduce that crusting that you'll see sometimes on the soil surface, where it's a hard surface and you sort of tap it maybe with your hoe or even with your foot, and it just sort of crumbles, and you can tell that it's just a crust on the top of the soil. Compost also helps increase the activity of soil microorganisms that release nutrients and other growth promoting materials into the soil. Now, the other additive that we talked about is leaf mold. And it is essentially, leaf mold is essentially composted shade tree leaves. In general, in the natural world, tree leaves turning into leaf mold, they do not undergo that heat generating, bacterially driven process of breaking down. Their process is a cooler, slower, fungal driven process. Now, the leaf mold can be mixed during the first time you till for preparing the bed, and it can also be used as a surface mulch. Now, the surface mulch will help maintain moisture, which is important for asparagus, but you also want to consider that in the springtime, a mulch also helps to possibly keep your soil just a little bit cooler, because you've got a covering over it and the sun's rays cannot reach directly down into the soil. So you might want to consider early in the spring pulling back your mulch a little bit, also when you're doing your weeding, and we'll get to that here in just a moment. Okay, so you want to use only leaf mold. Do not add fresh leaves into the soil that you're actively growing vegetables, asparagus, whatever, because tree leaves are high in carbon and low in nitrogen. They're 60-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. Generally, for a bacterial type of breakdown, you want a 24 carbon to 1, which is nitrogen ratio. But again, it's a high carbon to nitrogen ratio. Now, it still has to have nitrogen to help break down. And so what happens when you add fresh tree leaves, they will go ahead and use the nitrogen in the soil to break down the leaves. and that can lead to a deficiency in your plants. So again, do not add fresh leaves directly into the soil and try to start growing plants and that sort of thing, because you will find that the nitrogen may be used up by helping to break down those fresh leaves. However, given adequate time and moisture, several fungal decomposition of leaves result in an excellent material that can be added to the soil. I know people, and I have done this as well, sort of rake up leaves in the fall and put them all in a pile and wet them down, and then maybe come out and move them, you know, fluff them up a little bit with your pitchfork, whatever, your fork, you know, just to get them well incorporated occasionally, and then eventually they will start to break down. And it's a slower process, but they will break down. And again, they make excellent additive to your soil. Okay, now we're going to talk about plant selection. Asparagus is a plant that is dioecious, which means it has female plants and male plants. Now, female plants, they may have less spear production, but the spears are generally larger. Female plants generally tend to be shorter lived, and that is because the female plant not only are producing spears and that sort of thing, but if let go, which you let the ferns go to help store energy into the roots, and also if let go, they'll go ahead and produce flowers and seed. So some of that energy that would have gone into the roots to help next spring spear production is going into producing flowers and seed. These, the seed, and you'll see there, it's a little red berry. It's really quite attractive when you see it, but they can germinate and they'll produce a weedy little seedling patch around your asparagus bed. And you really don't want that, because it's just, they're competing for energy from your asparagus spears or asparagus crowns that you have planted, and you just don't want that. Now also, for the most part now, male plants, they are mostly hybrids. The male flowers produce no seeds. They grow a greater number of smaller, more uniform spears, and they tend to live longer, and they produce more spears over that time. So whereas with the female, you may get larger spears, less spear production, but larger spears, and then with the male, you get more spears, and they're generally a little smaller. Now in plant selections, we have had for years in my home garden the older cultivars of Martha Washington and Mary Washington, and I can't even remember which one it was or if we had both, but it was a mix of male and female plants, and they did great, but they do start to decline a little bit over the years, and we have noticed that there is some seed production where they'll produce the seedlings, which causes problems in your bed. We've discussed all that. So now, as we're renewing and regenerating our asparagus beds, we're going with all male hybrids. And again, we're developed for improved productivity, uniform spear size. The great thing about our all male hybrids as well is that they have a disease resistant to rust and the Fusarium root and crown rots. And that is a resistant, which means they can tolerate and fight it off. It's almost like our immune system. They can fight it off a lot better. Doesn't mean that they may not come down with it if the conditions are right, such as pH is too low and that sort of thing. However, they are very resistant to those. Also, there's many cultivars that vary in spear color, bright color, thickness, and length of spears, and earliness. So when you start to consider what you're going to grow, you want to consider those things as well. Now, transplant selections. There are several varieties available from garden shops and online. and I have beware there, when you're looking to purchase your transplants, and I would recommend that we use transplants, and we'll discuss that later on. You want to make sure that you're buying from someone reputable, and also it'd be great if you can sort of see what they're selling you. As again, I have that beware to you. I have noticed sometimes when you go to the big box stores and you'll see, I think we've all seen these displays of, you know, like summer bulbs and different types of plants like blueberries and blackberries, and they'll have asparagus spears in these tiny little boxes. If you open those up, you will look inside there, and generally they're packed in a sawdust, and you can see the spears in there, and or the roots mainly is what you see when you open it up. If they look shriveled and brown, and I hate to say it, but more often than not they are, just pass them by, because you will struggle with those plants. They may be an inferior grade to begin with, and if you're going to go into all of this you know, production and put all of this work and planning into this, you want to have great plants or great transplants to put in there. So you want to be aware of that, and then you also want to consider paying attention to the sex of the plant, resistance to the asparagus diseases. And what I have found for around here in Kentucky, and I'm here in central Kentucky, the Rutgers University bred Jersey ones seem to do really well. There's Supreme and Prince and Knight. They all have those, you know, very manly names type of thing, but they do have a high resistance to rust and are highly tolerant to Fusarium. Now, I taught this class back in 2017, and we had the class received two different types of asparagus. We had the Jersey Supreme, and from hearing from the class over the years, we have learned that for our area, the Jersey Supreme did seem to adapt well to any kind of short periods of drought that we had. Also, any unseasonable cold that maybe we had. You know how it gets warm. Lately it's been warming up in the spring, and then all of a sudden you'll have a really cold blast. Seemed to do well with that. And also, because this was a class of like 20 or 30 people, hearing back from all over the county and in different types of, you know, areas, maybe subdivisions or a, you know, a country garden, whatever, it seems to have fared well in a wide range of soil types. Okay, the three methods of planting asparagus. You have the seedling, which you can actually start your own seeds. You have seedling transplants, which you see there in the middle. And then you have the crowns, and that is what I would recommend. And here shows a really good example of what a good crown should look like. You can see that those roots are not a dark brown, they're not shriveled, they look, you know, rounded, nice and healthy. There's a lot of them. And then when you look at the top there, that is what is considered, that little tuft, that is the crown. And you see several little spikes where, you know, spears may start. That's what you're looking for. Now, what I had done is bought the crowns through, you know, like a catalog where they were mailed to me, or online catalog or something. They will come in a box, and as you see, they were wrapped in a rubber band right there, and those looked really particularly healthy. You can choose, you can plant 1, 2, or 3-year-old crowns. And a lot of people say, well, what's the difference? If I use a 3-year-old crown, does that generally mean that, okay, you know, I don't have to have that waiting period before we harvest? Not really. Generally, if you, I wouldn't recommend going with a 3-year-old crowns. It seems to be the consensus that generally a 3-year-old crown, you know, maybe the cast-offs or the leftovers that weren't, you know, quite up to par earlier. And so you want to go with a 1-year-old. I think most of commercial production will go with that 1-year-old. or 2-year-old. I would stick with a good 2-year-old crown. Now when they come in, you want to keep the crowns cool and dry before planting. And then you want to separate the crowns that are tangled and grown together, and they will be like a little tangled mass, and you just gently separate them. You want to locate the buds, the top part, that little crown part we saw there, and then the roots, so you're familiar with which end is up. And then also remove any rotted, shriveled roots. They, you know, they're essentially dead and you just don't want them around. It's just best to get rid of them ahead of time. Now, what to look for? Now, this is me. And I'm telling you all of this, and sometimes I think the very best you can do is, you know, trial and error. Now, this is on the right there where it says, yes, these are the plants or the transplants that I got a couple of years ago for a class I did, and they were fairly healthy. Now, there were a few in there that were shriveled and dead and that sort of thing, and I bought 2 different types, a Jersey Supreme and then also the Purple Passion. And in those, it seemed like the Jersey Supreme were maybe in a little better condition than the Purple Passion. But they looked like that on the right. And you can see, I tried to show you a difference because when I first took that picture 2 or 3 years ago, I didn't think about showing scale. So I sort of cut and pasted my own little scale. But that's about how big they were. And so this is a good example of what you don't want. Comparatively, they were very small. You can see that the roots are very shriveled, you know, and so there's going to be a lot of pruning on these. And you can see that, you know, the ones on the right have a jump start over the ones on the left. So you just have to be very careful about where you purchase and when you purchase. I think part of the problem too, well, not really for the size, but because of the shipping was delayed because of the COVID-19 thing. So, you know, it was a mess. So, but anyway, we'll use it for educational purposes. All is not lost. Okay, here's our bed spacing. When you're considering your beds, you want to plant crowns in rows of about 18 inches times 4 to 5 feet. You know, long or wide. Actually, your row can be as long as you want it to and as much area as you have. So you can think about putting it in rows, which is there to the right. You want them 18 inches apart in each within the row, and then you want them at least 18 inches apart, you know, between rows. And your rows can have as many plants as you feel like you can take care of. Or you can do the wide bed method, and this works well probably within raised beds, and you can produce your asparagus in raised beds. So you see that, you know, each asparagus crown is planted within 18 inches of the other. So, you know, you have, it's not a traditional row type system, and this would work really well here on the left for a raised bed situation. Now, planting depth is extremely important. Crowns grow both vertically and horizontally over several years, and correct planting depth helps plant to live a long time. So planting too shallowly can cause early sphere emergence in the spring, and which early sphere emergence, you know, we think, well, that's what we want. Well, but it also increases the risk of the crown freezing and damaging your spears to come on, and you know, that could have happened this year. Noticed a lot of my plants that came on, but then they got a freeze damage on them, so they got a lot of brown damage and everything, and that can even lead to winter kill of your plant. So you don't want to do that. Now, when you consider transplanting your crowns, you want to create a trench that is about 12 to 18 inches wide and 6 to 8 inches deep. You can see that by the diagram here. You want to place a small soil mound in the middle of the trench. For the trench length, or you can have it, say if you were doing it in that one that is sort of for a wide bed, you know, you can have a little mound of soil in each little trench that you have dug for individual plants. You want to take your crown, and with the bud side up, you want to spread the roots out uniformly, leaving the crown and the buds upright in the centered position. Now this says space the crowns 9 to 12 inches apart. Generally, the wider the better. So I would say anywhere between 12 to 18 inches apart. Okay, so you place your crown. You can see I've placed the crown there on top of that little soil mound. And you've got the roots spread out as well as you can with the crown and little buds sticking up. Now, after that, you want to fill in the trench until the crown is covered with 2 inches of soil. So you just see there, you haven't fully filled in your trench. You're covering it with at least 2 inches of the soil. Really, this depends on how big your mound is and other things. But you want to make sure that your crown is covered until all you can see maybe are the little tips there. And, you know, that is your first step. But then you will continually fill the trench as the plants take off and grow taller throughout the first summer. And the reason we do this is, again, because the transplants have a tendency to rise, and the crowns gradually will grow closer to the soil surface. Keep your bed well watered, and then, you know, that first summer you will continue to add soil there, but even after that, many gardeners sort of consider, you know, they'll add an additional 1 to 2 inches of soil, maybe from between the rows, if you have a row type of thing, in later years, but that is up to you. Now, this first summer, you want to provide a supplemental water because it increases the productivity and extends the life of the planting. It's especially important during the establishment, and not only during the first summer, but maybe you want to consider, you know, the first 2 years after planting your beds. Only water in mature beds during fern production, and only when it's appropriate. You know, if you've had sometimes like we've had here, plenty of rain, well, of course, you do not need to add any supplemental water. Nature is providing plenty of supplemental water. Now, you do want to stop your supplemental watering in the fall. And again, remember, it's that soil temperature that will signal dormancy, but also holding back water. And so if you stop any kind of supplemental watering, it's you doing it in the fall, then this will help to facilitate that asparagus dormancy. Now, for the first year, if you can, it would be good to leave the ferns standing, you know, over that first winter. And the reason for this, they say that, you know, if you remove the ferns too early, you can weaken the crown, and that will result in inadequate food for the roots and inadequate spear production. Then after that first year, you may want to consider removing, well, you do want to remove, if you can, your fern growth, and then burn that fern growth around the, after the first year of production and on. And by removing it and burning it, if you can, some people are not allowed to burn, you know, maybe you have it in town, but you probably want to destroy the fern growth or even throw it away, because this will help to eliminate potential disease problems that might otherwise develop during the growing season, or even insects. Insects will tend to overwinter in the ferny growth and that sort of thing. And if you leave it there or leave it close by, you're just overwintering disease and insects. So you want to get that out of the garden if you can. Watering. Soil moisture is important. I think we discussed that. If they don't show signs of drought stress very easily, so you want to make sure that they have plenty of water. So and a good rule of thumb, if the planting does not receive at least 1 inch of rain weekly, you'll want to soak the soil at least once a week, and a gentle, deep soaking is best, with about, that would make up for the 1 inch of rain weekly. And that's only when you're not getting rain as normal. Controlling the weeds. You want to weed before the spears break through the soil in early spring to avoid breaking off any spears. And generally you want to do that by hand if you can. Anytime you start to use hose or any other kind of equipment in your asparagus bed, you run the risk of breaking spears and roots and the crowns, and of course that can damage your plant. Definitely during the growing period, you want to pull the weeds out rather than using a hoe or anything. You also want to remove those ferny seedling volunteers of asparagus plants. And then after you've weeded and that sort of thing, you can add 3 to 4 inches of mulch on top of the beds. Now, earlier we said, when you add mulch, that is great during the summer months where it'll help conserve moisture and help to keep weeds down and that sort of thing. But you may want to think about early spring. You may not want to add that mulch back very early after you've weeded your bed, because mulch also is an insulator, so it will keep that bed a little cooler than what it normally would have been if there were no mulch on top of it and you allowed the sun to warm up that soil. And remember, asparagus breaks dormancy at a soil temperature of over 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's just something to consider about how early do you want your spears, and maybe just try it out and see if it makes a difference. Take good notes. Insects. The most common insects that we're looking for are the common and spotted asparagus beetles. And you will see their damage. It's sort of easy to spot the damage if you are inspecting your beds regularly and getting down in there and sort of really looking closely. The asparagus beetle will damage the spears because they feed on those spears, and it'll have browning and scarring and that sort of thing. Now, if you were growing this commercially, you probably wouldn't be able to sell that very well, or not to sell it for as a higher price or a premium price that maybe you could get for a nice, perfect looking spear. Excuse me. But if you were, growing it for the home garden, you just sort of have to consider, I don't think, it may affect the taste or whatever a little bit, but you can cut that out and still be able to eat your asparagus. One of the signs of having the asparagus beetle feeding on your shoots is when the spears come out. Generally, they go nice and straight. But if you see your spears starting to bend over a little bit, like making a little crook in a cane or a shepherd's crook, then you probably want to take a good close look and see what you've got. And what you'll be looking for, this is the asparagus beetle. You can see there in the middle a larva that is hatched. And then this one on the right is where I had generally noticed in the garden. And this is the stage you probably want to catch them at. It looks like your asparagus will have little black bristly hairs or something like that sticking out of them, and those are the eggs of the asparagus beetles. You can actually rub those off with your fingers, and that will help to stop that life cycle of that beetle. And generally I have gone ahead and scraped those off really well and been able to go ahead and eat it. But if left unchecked, you can see with all of those little egg cases develop into an asparagus beetle, well, you can have a population explosion in no time. So for diseases, you want to use good cultural control practices, and this includes also any kind of pest control too. Common diseases of the asparagus, we talked about this, are the Fusarium crown rots, asparagus rust, and purple spot. And generally, when you pick out your plant choice, you're looking for plants that say they are resistant to those types of things. So that's the first thing in good cultural practices. What to look for with the others: asparagus rust will leave yellow and rusty orange spots on the asparagus stems after harvest. Purple spot is just what you think it might be, a sunken purple spot on the spears, or it could even be like tan spots with purple borders, but on the mature stems, but you will see, you know, a purpling there. Plants suffering from crown rot will have poor growth. The leaves and stems will be yellow and may even die back. The affected crowns can be brown and decayed, especially if you know, there's one that you sacrifice and you cut into it. You can see that browning and that decay. And again, that Jersey line, the Jersey Giants, Jersey Knight, and other members of that are tolerant of crown rot and possibly some of the others. When to harvest? Okay, this is what everyone asks, you know, how long do I have to wait? Well, let's just work this out here. Newer male cultivars, let's say these are a male cultivar planted in 2020, this spring. That first spring, next year, 2021, you will not harvest any of the spears. You will allow the spears to become ferns and to build the strength of the crown. And then you'll allow those ferns to grow all summer long. And then remember, allow them to stay there over winter for this first year, because we don't want to damage the crowns. I guess the damaging the crown and overwintering, they sort of outweigh each other. So for this first year, you need to worry more about damaging the crown than overwintering any types of insects or diseases. In the second spring, which will be 2022, if plants have developed well over this past year before, you can begin harvesting lightly for 5 to 7 days. But that's only if you think your plants have developed well. You want to give your plants the best shot they can. But in 2022, that second spring, you can harvest lightly, say for 5 to 7 days. And then in that third spring, 2023, again, 10 to 14 days of harvesting of your beds. And then the fourth year and beyond, which is 2024 and beyond, then you will probably, your beds should be up and running and doing pretty well if you followed, you know, and kept a good eye on them. You can harvest your spears for 8 to 10 weeks. Oh, let's see, when to harvest. Traditionally, it's harvested after the third year, but I just previously, I gave you the information that if you buy some of the newer crowns, if you go with the Mary Washington or Martha Washington, then you don't want to harvest until after that third year. And then in any of them, when you start to harvest, you want to cut the spears that are the diameter of a pencil or larger and leave the others, okay? So remember that. You want to harvest anything that is a pencil size, diameter, or larger. And let's see, during the fourth year, then you can harvest from the first appearance in spring for approximately 8 to 10 weeks. And you want to harvest spears that are 5 to 10 inches in length if you can. Sometimes you might miss a day and they grow pretty quickly, but you can either cut them off or snap them off at the spear base. Now, one thing to remember, that if you're using a knife, you need to be very careful, because you don't want to get too deep into the soil or too close down to that soil or the spear where it comes out of the crown, because you could damage the crowns. Okay, harvest only pencil size and diameter or larger. You're looking to choose bright green stalks, with tightly closed tips. And the most tender stalks are apple green in color, and they may have a purpley tinged tip. And again, be careful when you're using that knife to harvest them. After you've harvested, let's say either it's, you know, that first 4 to 7 days, or, you know, maybe after the fourth year, 8 to 10, you want to allow the spears to grow, because again, the ferns create the energy stored in the crowns. Plants that are harvested too heavily and too soon can become weak and spindly, and the crowns may never recover. So remember that when you're tempted to harvest a little too soon, or maybe harvest a little more than you know you probably should. Now, approximate yield, and I guess, you know, this is relative, but for a 10-foot row is approximately 3 to 4 pounds a year. Although I do think some of the newer ones may produce a little more than that. Now, what is left here is our nutrition and some recipes. We won't dwell a lot of that on that. I did go ahead and make it a part of your PowerPoint here so that when, or if you want to, if you choose to print this off for your records or for notes or whatever, that you will have some of the recipes on here, you know, that you'll be able to see and to use. But asparagus is a good source of vitamin A, K, and C, folate, phytonutrients, you know, lots of good antioxidants. A half a cup of fresh steamed asparagus has 22 calories, 2 grams of protein, and 4 grams of carbohydrates. Now, asparagus will keep fresh for 1 to 2 weeks in the refrigerator. That is if, when you harvest them as quickly as possible, you want to refrigerate them. When you bring them back into the house, you may want to cut your ends off a little bit, and then if you're not going to use it immediately for that night's supper or whatever, for a salad or something, then you want to refrigerate those cut ends in water, say like in a mason jar or even a tea glass or something like that, upright. And if you can't fit that into your refrigerator, wrap some wet paper towels around the asparagus ends, and then just put the ends and that towel into a little plastic bag. You don't want to put the whole asparagus plant in this plastic bag. You're just trying to keep the moisture in. So put that in, store that in your refrigerator for like 1 to 2 weeks. 1 pound of asparagus will yield approximately 4 1/2 cup servings, which is about 6 spears a serving. Now, I'm not going to go into depth, as I said. Wash your asparagus in cool running water. You can use them, you know, it can be boiled, steamed, stir-fried, grilled. As my brother used to say, you can burn them, bake them, fry them. You can really do just about anything with these. If you try to lightly season them with herbs and butter and olive oil on a grill, they're usually pretty good that way. A lot of people love them that way. And then if it's mushy, the asparagus, and I loved my asparagus mushy when I was a kid, well, that's a sign that it's overcooked. All right, the next few, I just had those recipes there that I promised you. And then at the very end of it, I just have some remember. You know, you want to remember to remove any rotted roots. You want to remember that spacing is important for health and production. Also remember to let that fern grow, because that's important for production. And then if you have the newer male cultivars, you can probably be up and running, you know, with a good harvest by about 2023 if you planted it this year, or say the 3rd spring. Also, this is really important. Scout early in office often for disease and insect problems. You want to manage your moisture if needed. Always manage those weeds and remove any diseased plant material. A good source here, with UK, we have the Home Vegetable Gardening in Kentucky. It's called ID28 to a lot of us. You can get this from your local extension office. It has information from asparagus to zucchini. It has transplant tables, information about insects, diseases, just all kinds of really good information. It's just practically the Bible of home vegetable gardening in Kentucky, and it's a good resource for you to have. So ask your agent. The back here, I have resources. I do have information about all the counties where you can find your county office if you're not familiar. Also, online resources for that ID28 and some of the recipes. There's also the interactive plant harvesting zone if you're wondering what zone you're in. And then also all of my sources that I pulled from to make up this is here as well. So hopefully you'll be able to utilize some of that. And then I'll use my little question mark butterfly here for any questions.